They are in all the different tribes, and they're in the promised land, the land God promised to Abraham. And so they're there, they're installed, but they really don't have any central authority. They don't have like a governmental structure. What they have are several different tribes all living in the same area. So by the time you get to 1 Samuel, they're saying, we want a king. We want one king to unify us all so that we can be protected, so we can prosper. And so you have the original King Saul. After him, there's a very famous King David who consolidated the one united kingdom. And then after David, you have Solomon. Under Solomon, this one kingdom prospered. It was a time of peace. They really didn't have many enemies around them. So it was a time of plenty. It was a time of prospering and peace. And what Solomon did was he started building things. He built himself a palace, and he built this amazing temple to God. And this all happens about 1,000 years before Jesus is born. But right after Solomon, you have those three kings and this one united kingdom, and everything seems like it's perfect. They're in this kind of golden age. But after Solomon, there is political unrest. The tribes begin to get in conflict with each other. And they split. They actually split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, with most of the tribes, is called Israel. And they tend to wander away from God. They reject God, and eventually they're wiped out. The southern kingdom of Judah doesn't do too much better. They have some reformers, some kings who come in and try to bring them back to God, but they tend to wander into idolatry and not really holding to the covenant law that they agreed to. And so about 100 years after Israel is wiped out, Judah then has the empire of Babylon comes against them. They send their armies and they wipe out Judah. And they take everyone who's important politically, everyone who's rich, everyone who can do something, skills like a craftsperson or something, and they take them all back to Babylon with them. And the only people they leave in Jerusalem are the poorest, or the ones with the least amount of power themselves, just to tend to the fields to make sure they don't go fallow and wild. In fact, just going from the perspective of what it was like for them, there's a book called Lamentations. It's supposed to be written by the prophet Jeremiah, sitting in the wreckage of what used to be Jerusalem. And instead of saying, this awful thing has happened, it was really unlucky that Babylon came in and this happened, this is what he says in Lamentations 5. He said, "The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He swallowed up all its palaces and destroyed all the fortified cities. He has multiplied the mourning and lamentations within daughter Judah. He has wrecked his own temple as if it were merely a shack in a field, destroyed his place of meeting. The Lord has abolished all the appointed festivals and Sabbaths in Zion, and he has despised the king and priests in fierce anger. The Lord rejected his altar, repudiated his sanctuary. He has handed the walls of her palaces over to the enemies." And later on, he says this, "My eyes are worn out with weeping. I am churning within, and my heart is poured out in grief because of the destruction of my dear people, because infants and nursing babes faint in the street of the city." To really understand what the exile meant, or what going into captivity meant, we have to understand that is how it started. That it wasn't just this unfortunate circumstance. It wasn't just a more powerful nation. It was God rejecting his people because they had wandered away from him. It was God who had promised them that there would be, that this kind of thing would happen, who kept warning them throughout the prophets, like in Jeremiah, saying, this is what is coming. They continued to reject him. They continued to follow what they thought as their own gods, their own way of doing things. And because of that, because their worship of him was not genuine, it wasn't coming from their hearts, God rejected the places where they worshiped. He tore down his own altar because their offerings didn't mean anything. He tore down his own temple because the people in it weren't really dedicated. He tore down everything and got rid of it because it wasn't genuine. It wasn't real. There wasn't obedience. There wasn't mercy in Israel. There wasn't justice in Israel. There's just this kind of form of pretending to follow God while we did whatever we wanted, while we oppressed others, while we kept other people down. All of that was happening right there in the middle of Israel, and God rejected them because of And so seeing that happening is why where we pick up today is to really understand where we pick up today. We need to understand that part of it. You see, it seemed like everything was lost and everything was just done for, like that section we read out of Lamentations. But as we pick up today, this is where it starts in Ezra. This nation that seemed like it was indomitable, the kingdom of Babylon, they seemed like they would rule forever and they would always be in control. But they've been taken over by another kingdom called Persia. This is where we start in Ezra 1. In the first year of King Cyrus of this new empire, Persia, in order to fulfill the word the Lord spoke through Jeremiah, the Lord roused the spirit of the king of Cyrus to issue a proclamation throughout the entire kingdom and put it in writing. So things have radically changed. There's a new power who is ruling over everything, King Cyrus. And this king is not trying to hold on to Israel. He's not keeping them in captivity. He's willing to let them go. In fact, he is willing to be instructed by God to allow them to leave, to fulfill what God said in Jeremiah 25 or 29, where he said that this captivity wouldn't be permanent. There would be a period of time, 70 years, before it ended. This is what Cyrus says in his decree. Cyrus, king of Persia, says this: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you, may his God be with him, and may he go to Jerusalem and Judah and build the house of God of Israel." Oh, I have to catch up myself. "Let every survivor, wherever he resides, be assisted by the men of that region with silver and gold and goods and livestock and all that, as an offering for the house of God in Jerusalem." I think there's a little more going on here than it might say. Obviously, it is good that Israel is being released. They're being released from captivity. But if you read a little bit deeper into the text, this is something I see, and this is just something I came up with, so take it for what it's worth. But when we see this, that Israel is in captivity in Babylon, that God has influenced a king over them to allow them to leave, and that they are being given gifts. They're not just being allowed to go back to the promised land. They're being given gold and silver and gifts so they can go back. This reminds me of another story in the Old Testament, and that is a story out of the Exodus. Because there was, in the Exodus, Israel is captive. And God influences, very forcefully, he influences a king to allow them to leave. And in Exodus 3, God said this. He said, when he's talking to Moses, he says, I will give Israel such favor with the Egyptians that when they leave, they will not leave empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor or anyone staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and to put them on your sons and daughters. And so you will plunder the Egyptians. God, in the original Exodus, gave them something very similar to what we hear here. And actually in Ezra 1, if you go on, it says that each person was favorably disposed towards their neighbor, towards Israel, and gave these things willingly. This is like a recapitulation. It is happening again. We take the same thing that happened in Exodus and it's happening here. What happened in the original Exodus, what God did was he intervened on behalf of a people who could not help themselves. He intervened and led them out, and by his own power made them his people. What seems to be happening here is that it's happening again. God is leading them out. He has bent the course of all of history and the hearts of the leaders over them so that he can have his people back. After what we read in Lamentations, they sound odd. But in the law, early on, under Moses, it says this in Deuteronomy. God says that there are consequences for following and serving him, that they have made an agreement to be his people. And if they follow his law, they'll be blessed. If they do not, there will be curses that join it or accompany it. But he says this, after all these things have happened, these blessings and curses, all of that in your history, and you come to your senses once you have strayed, while you are in nations where God has driven you out, and you and your children return to God and obey him with all your hearts and souls by doing all he commanded, then he will restore you. He'll have compassion, and even if your exiles are in the farthest horizon, he will gather you back. The Lord will bring you back into the land your fathers possessed, and you will take possession of it. So this this time of exile was not meant to be entirely permanent. In fact, in the prophets, we see that this remnant that remains, that are now obedient and willing to come back, what God was looking for. Because he was not looking for worship from people just to say, just to show his own splendor, to do any of that. He wants that, like it says in John, in spirit and in truth. So what God has done is not just brought his people back. He's reestablished their identity as his people. Like it says, I believe in Exodus, where he says, you will be my people, I will be your God. He's reestablishing that covenant. These are the first steps towards binding and mending that relationship. So he's reestablished them as his people, and they are coming back. Move to this next part. I'm going to skip over most of chapter 2. That is not because chapter 2 is unimportant, but it is one of those long things, long lists that you get in the Old Testament. And while those are important and they can help you understand some things that come later, it's really not relevant to what we're talking about now. So we're going to pick up in 3. So the 7th month arrived, and the Israelites were in their towns, and people gathered as one in Jerusalem. Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his brothers and the priests, along with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his brothers, began to build the altar of Israel's God in order to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on the foundation and offered burnt offerings in the morning and evening on it to the Lord, even though they feared the surrounding people. A lot there to unpack. First is this guy, you probably knows him, Zerubbabel, if anyone remembers him. He was one of the few people I remembered as a kid, just because I like saying his name. He's a descendant of the Davidic line. He comes from the line of David. So you have this kind of continuity between what used to be and what is now. He's not really their king, but he is their leader right now. We have this guy, Zerubbabel, who you hear a lot about probably in the next couple weeks. Just know that he's the leader of this whole group. But the point I want to look at here, as it pertains to worship, is this. They set up an altar, and that's great, but they feared the surrounding people. So my question is, why are they setting up the altar first? It seems like setting up walls, or just guys with spears or something, would have been preferable and the priority. It seems like safety should have been your priority. So the question is, why is it so important that they murder baby lambs in the morning and evening to God, and that is the priority? I guess you could ask this a different way. Why is it so important for all of us to come out and sing about God in the middle of an epidemic? See, the priority they have is in worship. When we talk about worship, I'm not just talking about singing songs or things like that. That can be part of it. But what Israel is doing here, if you look at how they have gotten to where they are, it's really hard to think of what else they could have done. Because for Israel, what they have done, if you're looking at it from their perspective, God has not only chastened and chastised them, he has bent the will of kings and changed the course of history and has brought down empires himself to bring them here, not only just to bring them back, but to bring them back loaded down with gold and silver. He has blessed them, bringing them back, and he has done all of this. And it's because of who they are. They are his people. Worship is just an extension of who we are. Whatever identity we have or hold on to, that is what we are going, that is how we are going to express, whatever identity we have is going to be shown in what we worship. Whatever we acknowledge as most important, that is what we really hold here. Just to give a working definition for me, you could probably come up with a better one on your own, but worship is just that acknowledgement of who God is and who we are in relationship to him. It is saying, this is the truth about God, and this is the truth about me because of it. It is saying, this is my Savior, and through him I am saved. And that does not end here at church. And some people, I've heard people say, worship services are kind of like recharging your batteries. You come in and feel real good when you're leaving the church, and you really need it again by the time you come back because you just get worn down during the week. really, it's good that you get that kind of experience. Really, worship is something that's meant to extend to our entire lives. It is not something that we just conduct here. It is in everything we do. It says in 1 Corinthians 10 that whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do so for the glorification of God. It's doing this at our jobs, as we raise our kids, when we're in church or when we're out of church. It is the acknowledgement of who God is in everything we do. And the reason we do this is because it is natural. It is natural for the creation to acknowledge its creator. If you look at Luke 19:40, it says there Jesus is being praised by the people as he approaches Jerusalem. And the Pharisees, and they're saying, stop them. You have to stop people from doing this. This is wrong. And he says, if they stop, the rocks themselves will cry out. Because this is the truth. I am their creator. And it is in their nature to cry out to me. Read Psalm 148. It says that, praise the Lord, all of the earth, and all the monsters of the sea and the ocean depths, lightning and hail and clouds and stormy wind, who all execute his commands, mountain and hills. It goes on and on. How everything in creation, in its natural place and order, gives praise and acknowledgement to who its creator is. Worship is a natural extension of who we are, and its expression of who we are. So, let's look at the next part here. Getting back into Ezra. So in 3:6, so they are worshiping by sacrificing on the altar, right? On the first day of the 7th month, they begin to sacrifice offerings, and the foundation of this temple that they're trying to rebuild, that hasn't even been set. But they're giving money to stonecutters and artisans, and food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so they would bring cedar wood from Lebanon through Joppa by the sea. They are getting all the raw materials they need. They're trying to accumulate this stockpile of everything they're going to possibly need so they can build this. And then you notice, sorry, my allergies are killing me. Excuse me. And then you see an 8. No, you don't see that. Now you see an 8. That a lot of time has passed. The second month of the second year. So we've gone from the 7th month, gone to the end of the year, and picked up a new year, and now we're in the second month. We've gotten everything we need. So they assemble for making God's house. Zerubbabel, again. Yeshua, again. All the priests, the Levites, everyone had returned from captivity, and they began to build. Do you see how many different types of worship were in that just brief paragraph there? They are continuing to worship formally at the altar. They are worshiping by giving. And in fact, in 268, one of the places we missed, or skipped, the people who are coming back give a free will offering. They give thousands of pounds of silver and thousands of pieces of gold for the rebuilding of the temple. This kind of largesse and generosity is meant as an act of worship to God. You see people here who are, when it says they began building, we're not going to get to building the temple yet. Today, we are just getting to laying the foundation. So essentially what they're building is just moving a bunch of rocks. Is all they're doing. But this is a form of worship. There are all sorts of different ways we worship God. And again, it gets back to that, acknowledging who he is in what we are doing and who we are because of him. Whether it is being generous and taking care of others. Whether it is using skills. If you want to see anything about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians and in Romans, there's gifts that range from the really pyrotechnic and cool that involve, healings and speaking in tongues, to things like administrative gifts and just helping people. There's all sorts of gifts given. In Exodus, when the tabernacle was being made, the kind of movable temple before Israel was in the promised land, there was a man, I always get his name wrong, but it was Bezalel, and it said that they didn't have enough people to make everything for the tabernacle. So God's Spirit settled on one person. He said, I have just miraculously given him all the knowledge he needs for all these kind of practical skills that you people, as a bunch of shepherds, don't have. A spiritual gift just to make sure that they had what they needed to construct the tabernacle. There's all sorts of gifts, and there's all sorts of ways we worship, whether that is up here singing songs, or whether it's lugging a bunch of rocks. all of it can be done to God's glory. And we see that here in Ezra. Everything they are doing is just an extension of their identity as God's people. And everything they're doing contributes to that, or is evidence of that. Let's pick up in 10. So after they were lugging rocks. You don't get a lot of detail about that, and that's probably for the best. So in 10, the builders the foundation is finished. So we're fast forwarding again. Foundation of the Lord's temple is done. The priests dress in their robes. If you look back in some of the boring parts of the Old Testament, you can see how detailed and finely made all of these robes are. The priests dressed in these fine, elaborate robes and holding these trumpets. And the Levites, who were descended from Asaph, holding cymbals, took their positions to praise the Lord as King David instructed them. So we have returned to the promised land. We've reestablished this identity of who we are. We acknowledge that. We know what we are coming to do. Our priorities are straight. We start worship immediately. And in every other step of the way, all of it is also worship. But now we're getting together. And one interesting thing about this, and again, just take this for what it's worth, this is just from me. They're standing on a big foundation, so a bunch of rocks that are leveled and set. I think it's Chronicles, David didn't build the temple, Solomon did. But David had a lot of ideas that he handed on to Solomon. And part of that was how musicians and music should be conducted. And so there are specific areas that different instruments and different people stand. But there is no temple. There's no building. So these people are going to spots marked out on your foundation where they would stand, and they're gathering in these places. There is no building, but they are still engaging in worship, making a kind of temple just by standing out there and placing their bodies in the proper places. This, and again, take this for its worth, this reminds me so much of the New Testament, where it says that the temple has been destroyed, but the author says, you yourselves, amongst you, you are the temple. The Holy Spirit dwells and resides amongst you. We see a precursor to that here. There is no building, but God's worship continues. And it continues as His Spirit is present among the people who are standing there on the foundations of what they have lost. And what do? They sing. They engage in corporate worship. Now, I had a buddy of mine once who, he was a good guy, but he asked me, asked him why I go to church. And I told him, I like to be together with people, worship is good and everything. He said, okay, I'll go with you if you explain to me this. It's like, why, if God is all powerful, does He need me to show up every week with a bunch of other people in a building and tell Him how cool He is? And it's a good question. The answer is, as hopefully you can see, it's not that. It is an extension of who we are. And who we are as Christians, we are a church. We are saved together. The salvation described in the New Testament is not something that is meant to occur in isolation, in a vacuum. It is the induction into a community, into a family. It is about moving into God's kingdom. So, as we see here, corporate worship is very important. We worship in all those other ways. But also the corporate worship is not just for God. It's for us to join together and acknowledge who He is, who we are in Him, and sing things like, He is good, His faithful love endures forever. All people giving a great shout and praising God, because that is what we've been made to do. Because what He has done for us is worthy of this kind of praise. There's a psalm in Psalm 136. It goes like this. And I took this out of NIV because it formats it like this. So it looks like, and it's possible, but it looks like you have this side, in the normal plain text, is the worship leader. And this is the response from the group. So like if I were to say, give thanks to the Lord for He is good. That was awful. Give thanks to the Lord for He is good. His love endures forever. Better. Give thanks to the Lord, the God of gods. His love endures forever. And you can go on from there, like this. Going down this actually goes through all of creation and through the entry into the promised land. You see that this is a custom that Israel has engaged in. It is an important part of their culture, not because God needs them, not because they're not sacrificing on an altar because God needs a bunch of dead goats. They're sacrificing because that is their form of wealth. They're sacrificing because then it is shared among them as food. It is given as part of a community exercise, acknowledging who they are, who their God is, and saying this: his love endures forever. And that is what we do here corporately. So not only is worship in every part of our life and meant to be expressed individually, it is meant to be done corporately as well, here together. We're going to do that in just a minute here. And one of the practices we have that is an excellent example of this is communion. Communion is something meant to be taken together. In all the language in the New Testament, it's meant to be taken as a group together, just like Jesus shared it. Okay. We've gone over a lot. This is the last section, starting in 12. So you have everyone standing on the foundations, shouting out to God. But there's this one caveat here, this is kind of addendum. But many of the older priests, the Levites, the family heads, who had seen the first temple, wept loudly when they saw the foundations of this temple. But many others shouted joyfully. People could not distinguish the sound of joyful shouting from the weeping, because people were shouting so loudly, and that sound was heard far away. When we talk about worshiping God, it is not just the kind of jumping up and down in the aisles, praise of God. It can be that. But we as people aren't always just happy. Everything isn't always just great. And that is part of who we are. And so that naturally comes into worship. When the people here, there is a group who are, especially the ones who had seen Solomon's temple in all of its splendor, that was made at the height of his power and wealth. And now they're looking at a completely new foundation. It doesn't say it explicitly, but it seems like they're looking at what they have lost. They're saying, there is no way that we can ever make anything that rivals that. The thing that we're throwing up here, it might be nice, but it will never be like that. That is lost forever. And they're mourning over that. There's another group of people who are looking forward. They're saying, look, we have the foundation down. We just need to put up the walls and everything. And God has made this all happen. And so surely he is going to take us into the future. And there will continue to be worship of our God as there should be here at his temple again. And I don't think either of those things is wrong. Neither of those things is inherently wrong. If you look through the Psalms, it surprised me as a kid. I would look through the Psalms, and how many of them start off with things like, where are you, God? Why are you silent? Why are you far from me? Where have you gone? Why is this happening? How can you allow this to happen? All of these things come up. In fact, if you look at two Psalms, Psalm 22 and 23, right next to each other, people think they may have been meant to be read together as like a unit. Psalm 22 is famous because Jesus quotes it on the cross when he's dying in Mark and Matthew. It goes, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it doesn't get much cheerier than that. It kind of comes around to the fact that God has been faithful in the past, but it's still pretty bleak. And that, we think, is meant to flow into Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down beside still waters. That worship is not plastering a plastic smile on your face and trying to sound nice and make sure everyone knows you're happy here. It is meant to be where we approach God from wherever we are, bringing whatever we have, whether that is frustration or anger or feelings of abandonment or loneliness or anything. All of that, as long as it's brought in that way of acknowledging who God is and the truth of who we are in him, that all of that is worship. So as we start looking through, or looking to actually worship